There are truths buried deep in the soil of Louisiana, truths never entered into ledgers, never stamped onto birth records, never spoken aloud in daylight. They survived instead in whispers, in half-burned diaries, in stories passed carefully from one generation to the next. This is the story of one such truth, a discovery that split a community into not because it was unknown, but because it was known by everyone, and acknowledged by no one. At Belle Reve Plantation, something unsettling began to happen. Light-skinned babies started appearing in the slave cabins. Not rumors, not isolated cases, patterned, repeated. Each birth followed by the same ritual of silence: averted eyes, sealed lips, secrets spreading like weeds between the cotton rows. This story isn't about curses or restless spirits. It's about something far more disturbing. It's about the truth. The midwife known as Aunt Truth had lived long enough to recognize when something was wrong. At 63, her hands had delivered more than 200 children across Belle Reve and neighboring plantations along the Mississippi. She knew the rhythms of birth, the dangers, the rare complications nature sometimes revealed. But on an April night in 1847, when she was summoned to Sarah's cabin, a girl no more than 16, Ruth felt a heaviness in the air she couldn't name. The labor had dragged on through the night. By dawn, Sarah's screams had faded into broken, exhausted whimpers. Ruth worked by the flicker of 2 candles, her hands steady from decades of practice. Mary, Hattie, and old Cora stood nearby in the shadows, their faces tight with a fear that went beyond concern for a difficult birth. None of them spoke. They didn't need to. When the child finally emerged, Ruth froze. The baby was pale. Not the warm reddish tone of a newborn of mixed heritage. Not the deep brown of Sarah's own skin. But paly skin the color of fresh cream. Fine hair that would almost certainly lighten with age. Features that, once seen, could never be explained away. For a moment, no one breathed. Ruth wrapped the child in cloth with shaking hands. The women exchanged glances heavy with understanding. This was not an accident. It was not new, and it was not safe to speak of. Outside, the plantation was waking. Inside that cabin, another secret had just been born, a one that would never be written down, but would be remembered all the same. Questions no one on Belle Reve wanted to answer. The silence in that cabin was absolute. Ruth had been a midwife long enough to know what silence meant. She wrapped the baby quickly, her movements mechanical, her face carefully blank. She placed the infant in Sarah's arms without meeting the young mother's eyes. Sarah looked down at her daughter and began to cry. Not tears of joy, tears that came from somewhere deeper. Somewhere Ruth recognized but couldn't name in that moment. She healthy? Sarah whispered. She healthy? Ruth confirmed. She going to live? She going to live? But both women knew that wasn't really the question Sarah was asking. Mary stepped forward from the shadows, her voice barely audible. Anybody know yet? Ruth shook her head slowly. Not yet. But come morning? She didn't need to finish. Come morning, the overseer would make his rounds. Come morning, the news would spread. Come morning, everyone would know and everyone would understand exactly what it meant. The baby was named Claire, though Sarah had wanted to name her something else, something that didn't sound so obvious, but Aunt Ruth had insisted in that firm way she had when she knew something important. Give her a name that fits how she looked, Ruth had said. Make it easier on everyone. Sarah hadn't understood then, but she would. Within 3 months, another light-skinned baby was born in the quarters. This time to a woman named Dinah, who was 20 years old and had already buried one child. The baby boy had hair that was distinctly orange and eyes that would turn green by his first birthday. Dinah named him Thomas. By the end of 1847, there were 4 such children in Belle Reve's slave quarters. By the end of 1848, there were 9. The pattern was impossible to ignore, yet everyone pretended not to see it. The white families who lived in the big plantation houses along that stretch of the Mississippi continued their social visits. They attended church together on Sundays. They discussed crops and weather and politics. Their wives organized charity events and quilting circles, and they never ever mentioned the babies. But in the slave quarters, There was a different kind of silence. It was the silence of women who understood too much and could say too little. The silence of mothers who held their light-skinned children a little tighter when footsteps approached. The silence of knowing. Aunt Ruth kept a mental record that she shared with no one. She noted which women gave birth to these children. She noted the timing. She noted the patterns of who disappeared from the fields or the big house on certain nights and which babies appeared 9 months later. And she noticed something else. Something that made her blood run cold. The babies weren't random. They came in clusters. Certain months were worse than others. Certain times of year when the master's brother visited from New Orleans. Certain weeks when the overseer's cousin came to stay. Certain seasons when particular guests occupied the guest quarters. It was systematic. It was predictable. It was happening by design. As the children grew, the problem became more visible. Claire, Sarah's daughter, had blue eyes and hair that lightened to honey blonde by age 3. She stood out among the other children like a daisy in a field of wheat. Visitors to Belle-Rive would stop and stare, their faces showing confusion, then understanding, then careful neutrality. Thomas developed freckles across his nose. His green eyes and reddish hair made him look like he could have belonged to any of the Irish families working the docks in New Orleans. A little girl named Lily had straight brown hair and features so European that she could have walked through the French Quarter without a single person questioning her presence. The children played together in the dirty yards between cabins, but even among themselves they were different. The other children treated them with a strange mixture of distance and protectiveness, as if they understood, even at that young age, that these children carried a burden that made them dangerous to know. Martha, one of the older enslaved women who worked in the big house, watched all of this with growing dread. She'd been at Belle-Rive for 34 years. Since she was 10 years old, she'd seen 3 generations of the Beaumont family run the plantation. She'd seen masters come and go, overseers hired and fired, children born and buried, but she'd never seen anything like this. One evening in late 1849, Martha sat with Aunt Ruth on the steps of Ruth's cabin, shelling peas in the fading light. They worked in silence for a long time before Martha finally spoke. "How many now?" she asked quietly. Ruth didn't ask what she meant. 14 living. 2 didn't make it past their first year. They getting older. Yes, people going to start asking questions. People already asking questions, Ruth said. Just not out loud. Martha's hands stilled in the bowl of peas. What they going to do with them children, Ruth, when they get older, when they old enough that people can't pretend no more? Ruth didn't answer because she didn't have an answer. She'd been asking herself the same question for 2 years now, and every possibility she considered ended in tragedy. In March of 1850, a slave trader named Chester Booth arrived at Belle-Rive. This wasn't unusual. Traders came through regularly looking to buy or sell, conducting the grim business that kept the plantation system running. But this visit was different. Booth spent 3 days at the plantation, and during those 3 days, he never once visited the adult quarters. Instead, he asked specifically to see the children. Word spread through the cabins faster than fire. Mothers grabbed their babies and held them close. The light-skinned children were hidden in root cellars, storage sheds, anywhere they might be overlooked. Aunt Ruth remembered watching from the door of her cabin as Booth walked through the quarters with Master Beaumont's son, Henry. Henry was 26 years old, recently married to a woman from a prominent Charleston family and increasingly involved in running Belle-Rive. She watched Booth point at one cabin, then another. She watched Henry shake his head repeatedly. She watched the argument that ensued, conducted in voices too low to hear, but with body language that spoke volumes. Finally, Booth left Belle-Rive without purchasing a single person. That night, Henry Beaumont came to the quarters himself, something that almost never happened after dark. He walked to Sarah's cabin and stood in the doorway. "The child," he said simply, "let me see her." As Sarah pulled Claire closer, her face showing terror. She tried desperately to hide. The 3-year-old girl looked up at the man in the doorway with curious blue eyes. Henry stared at the child for a long moment. His face was unreadable in the dim lantern light. Then he turned and walked away without another word. He visited 4 more cabins that night, looking at 4 more light-skinned children, saying nothing. Then he disappeared back toward the big house. The sale never happened, but everyone understood what it meant. Someone had wanted to buy the children. Someone had wanted to take them away, and Henry Beaumont had refused. The question that kept Ruth awake that night was simple. Why? Martha discovered the ledger by accident in the summer of 1851. She'd been cleaning Master Beaumont's study. The old master, Henry's father, who was 71 now and increasingly frail. He spent most days in his wheelchair, looking out over the plantation he'd built, saying little. The ledger had fallen behind the desk, wedged between the wall and a heavy filing cabinet. Martha only found it because she dropped a cleaning rag and had to reach into the narrow space to retrieve it. It was a small book bound in dark leather with no label on the cover. Martha knew she shouldn't open it. Enslaved people caught reading could be punished severely, and being caught reading the master's private papers could mean far worse. But something about the hidden location, the unmarked cover, the way it had been concealed rather than filed with the other plantation records, something made her slide it into her apron. That night, by candlelight in her cabin, Martha opened the ledger. She'd learned to read as a child, taught secretly by a previous master's daughter, who'd thought it would be entertaining to educate the house slaves. That young woman had died of yellow fever at age 14. And Martha had never revealed her literacy since. It was too dangerous. Knowledge was currency she couldn't spend without risking everything. But now, as she looked at the pages before her, she wished she'd never learned to read at all. The ledger was a record, a meticulous, detailed record. Names, dates, notations that made Martha's hands shake. Sarah, April 12, 1847. Female, light completion, noted. Dinah, September 3, 1847. Male, auburn hair, problematic Rachel. November 28, 1847. Female, eyes too light, requires monitoring page after page, entry after entry. Each one documenting what Martha had suspected, but never wanted to confirm. But it was the notes in the margins that truly horrified her. Next to Sarah's entry, H.B. visiting from Baton Rouge, March 1846. Next to Dinah's entry, Overseer Collins, dismissed, December 1847. Next to Rachel's entry, guest name unknown, winter party season. The ledger wasn't just recording births. It was recording paternity. It was documenting exactly who was responsible for each child, matching dates of conception with visits with guests, with the movements of free white men through Belle Reve. And the handwriting was unmistakable. It belonged to Henry Beaumont. Martha closed the ledger, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst through her chest. She understood now why Booth's sale had been refused. She understood the visits to the cabins that night. She understood why the children were still here. Henry wasn't protecting the children out of mercy. He was protecting evidence. He was protecting his family's reputation. He was protecting himself and every white man whose initials appeared in those margins. The children were witnesses, living, breathing proof of crimes that polite society pretended didn't exist. And Martha now held that proof in her hands. Martha knew she had to return the ledger before it was missed. But first, she needed to tell someone who could understand the full implications of what she'd found. She went to Aunt Ruth. The old midwife sat very still as Martha whispered the contents of the ledger. When Martha finished, Ruth was quiet for so long that Martha wondered if she'd spoken at all. Finally, Ruth spoke. How many names in those margins? 17 different men. Ruth closed her eyes. Lord have mercy. What we going to do? Ruth's eyes opened sharp and hard. We ain't going to do nothing. You're going to put that book back exactly where you found it, and you're going to forget you ever saw it. But Ruth, listen to me. child." Ruth's voice was steel. "You think knowing this helps anybody? You think there's someone we can tell who don't already know? You think there's justice somewhere waiting for women like Sarah and Dinah and Rachel?" Martha felt tears burning her eyes. Those children are alive because their existence is an embarrassment, not a crime. The day that ledger becomes public is the day those children become a problem that needs solving. And I've seen how rich white men solve their problems. The truth of it hit Martha like a physical blow. The ledger wasn't protection. It was a liability. And if anyone discovered it was missing, if anyone thought the enslaved people had seen it, had read it, had understood it, the children would disappear, the women would disappear. Anyone who knew too much would disappear. "Put it back," Ruth said again. "And pray nobody ever finds it." Martha returned the ledger the next morning, sliding it back into the gap behind the desk. Her hands were shaking so badly she nearly dropped it twice. She never touched it again, but she couldn't unknow what she'd read. Despite the fear, despite the knowledge, despite everything, the babies kept coming. 1851 brought 3 more. 1852 brought 2. 1853 brought 4. By 1854, there were 26 light-skinned children living in Belle Reeve's quarters, ranging from newborns to 7-year-olds. They represented nearly a quarter of all children born in the quarters during those years. The women who bore these children fell into a strange hierarchy. They weren't trusted by some of the other enslaved people who saw them as collaborators or worse. But they weren't accepted by the white household either. Despite the evidence of their forced connections, they existed in a liminal space belonging nowhere. Sarah, now 23 years old, had given birth to 2 more children since Claire. One appeared a mixed race in the traditional sense. The other, a boy born in 1852, was nearly as pale as Claire herself. Sarah had stopped speaking much. She did her work in the fields with mechanical efficiency, her face a mask that revealed nothing. At night, she held her children and sang to them in a voice so quiet that only they could hear the words. Dinah had fared worse. After Thomas, she'd had one more light-skinned child, a girl who died at 6 months of fever. Dinah had stopped eating properly after that. She grew thin and distant, her eyes taking on a look that Aunt Ruth recognized as the beginning of the end. Some women broke under the weight of it. Others grew hard as iron. Rachel became the latter. She was 25 now, mother to 3 children, 2 of whom had light skin and European features. She'd begun speaking up in ways that terrified the other women, talking back to the overseer, working slowly enough to be noticed, maintaining eye contact when she should have looked away. "She courting death," Martha whispered to Ruth one evening. "She courting something worse than death," Ruth replied. "She courting attention." And attention was the last thing any of them could afford. Everything changed when the inspector came. His name was Robert Finch and he represented a religious organization from Boston that had been investigating conditions on southern plantations. It was 1854 and tensions between North and South were escalating. Abolitionists were becoming bolder, and some plantation owners, trying to counter the negative publicity, had begun allowing limited inspections to prove that enslaved people were well treated. Old Master Beaumont, now bedridden, but still making decisions, had agreed to allow such an inspection at Belle Reeve. Henry had argued against it, but his father had overruled him. "We got nothing to hide," the old master had declared. "Let them see how well we treat our people." Finch arrived on a humid August morning with a notebook and a determined expression. He was in his 40s, thin and serious, with the zeal of a man on a moral mission. Henry gave him a tour of the facilities, the quarters, the infirmary, the food distribution center, the chapel. Everything was in order, clean, designed to show Belle Reeve in the best possible light. But then Finch asked to observe the children. Henry's jaw tightened, but he couldn't refuse without raising suspicion. He led Finch to the area behind the cabins where the children, too young for field work, spent their days under the supervision of the older women. Finch stood and watched the children play for nearly 10 minutes. His expression shifted from neutral observation to confusion, then to something that might have been shock. He turned to Henry. "Some of these children appear to be, that is, their complexion is mixed heritage. Henry said smoothly. Some of our people have white ancestry from previous generations. It shows up unexpectedly sometimes. It was a reasonable explanation. It was even partially true in some cases. But Finch was looking at Claire, who at 7 years old looked like she belonged in a schoolhouse in Boston, not a slave cabin in Louisiana. He was looking at Thomas, whose green eyes and freckles were impossible to explain away as previous generations. How many children of this complexion were born here? Finch asked carefully. I don't keep records of such things, Henry lied. Finch wrote something in his notebook. I'd like to speak with some of the mothers privately. That won't be possible. They're working. Then I can wait until they return from the fields. Henry's face remained calm. But Martha, who was standing nearby pretending to sweep, saw his hands clench. Mr. Finch, I believe we've been accommodating to your inspection. But I must insist on some boundaries. These women have work to do. They don't have time for interviews that serve no productive purpose. Finch met his eyes. Mr. Beaumont, the purpose of my visit is to assess the conditions and treatment of enslaved people. The presence of numerous light-skinned children born to dark-skinned mothers is directly relevant to that assessment. The air between them turned electric. Finally, Henry spoke, his voice dangerously soft. Mr. Finch, you are a guest on my family's property. I suggest you be careful about the implications you make. The morality of Boston doesn't dictate the realities of Louisiana. These are complex situations with complex histories. Unless you have specific evidence of wrongdoing, I'd recommend you focus your report on the material conditions you came to evaluate. Finch held his ground. I would still like to speak with the mothers. Number. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. Finch stared at Henry for a long moment, then turned and walked away toward the guest quarters where he'd been staying. He left Belle Reve the next morning, his inspection incomplete. His report, when it was published 3 months later in a Boston newspaper, mentioned the unusual demographic patterns observed at Belle Reve Plantation, but contained no specific accusations. It was carefully worded, legally safe, and completely ignored by every authority in Louisiana. But the damage was done. Other inspectors began to show interest. Questions started being asked in church gatherings. Whispers spread through the network of plantations along the river. And Henry Beaumont began making plans. It started slowly. So slowly that at first no one was sure it was happening. In January 1855, Claire disappeared from Belle Reve. Sarah woke one morning to find her daughter's sleeping mat empty. She ran from cabin to cabin, panic rising in her throat, asking if anyone had seen Claire. No one had. The overseer, a man named Mr. Webb, who'd replaced Collins years ago, told Sarah that Claire had been transferred to another property for her own good. He wouldn't say where. He wouldn't say why. He told Sarah to get back to work and stop asking questions. Sarah spent 3 days screaming Claire's name in the fields before she went silent. After that, she never spoke another word. Not to the other workers, not to her remaining children, not to anyone. She worked. She ate when food was placed before her. She slept when night came. But the woman who'd been Sarah was gone. 2 months later, Thomas vanished. Then Lily, then 2 more of the light-skinned children. By the end of 1855, all 14 of the obviously CM Martha read the letter 3 times. Then she sat down to write a response. It took her 2 hours to compose 3 paragraphs. Her writing was shaky. She hadn't written anything in years. But the words were clear. Dear Claire, she alive, she remember. She never forgot. But she can't speak no more. Not since you left. Her mind somewhere else. Somewhere we can't reach. You got a good life. You got children and safety. Your mama would want you to keep that. Don't come back. But no, she loved you more than life itself. Still do, Martha. She sent the letter and never heard from Claire again. But 3 months later, an envelope arrived at Belle Reve addressed to Sarah. Inside was a photograph, a formal portrait of a beautiful blonde woman in an elegant dress standing with a bearded man and 2 small children. On the back, in that same elegant handwriting, was written simply, "Thank you for my life." Martha gave the photograph to Sarah. The woman looked at it for a long moment, her eyes showing recognition that her voice could no longer express. Then she tucked it into her dress close to her heart, and returned to her cabin. She kept that photograph until the day she died. By 1875, Bellerive was struggling. The old plantation system couldn't sustain itself with paid labor. Even the exploitative sharecropping system Henry had implemented. Competition from western states was driving cotton prices down. The glory days were ending. Henry Beaumont, now 51 years old, sat in his father's old study one evening, reviewing ledgers, the official ones, showing the financial collapse of everything his family had built. He pulled out the hidden ledger from its drawer, the one documenting a different kind of accounting. He read through it slowly, looking at names of children who'd be adults now, looking at dates that spanned decades, looking at the initials in the margins that included his own. H.B. Henry Beaumont. He'd made 6 entries himself over the years. 6 children who bore his features, carried his blood, and had been erased from history to protect his reputation. He wondered where they were now, if they were alive, if they hated him, if they even knew who he was. Probably better that they didn't. He took the ledger to the fireplace and stared at it for a long time. He should burn it, destroy the evidence, let the past die with the past. But something stopped him. Maybe it was vanity, the need to preserve some record of his own children, even the ones he couldn't claim. Maybe it was fear, the suspicion that copies existed, and destroying the original would only make him look guilty if they surfaced. Maybe it was something else entirely, something he couldn't name. He put the ledger back in the drawer and locked it. It stayed there for another 43 years. In 1918, Bellerive was sold to a timber company. The Beaumont family had finally surrendered to economic reality. Henry had died in 1903. His children had moved to cities pursuing different lives. The plantation house had fallen into disrepair. The timber company planned to tear down the old house and use the land for lumber operations. During the demolition, workers found the ledger in a sealed compartment built into the wall behind what had been Henry Beaumont's office desk. Someone had hidden it there deliberately, probably shortly before Henry's death. The worker who found it was a young man named William Harris. He was 23, black and literate, part of a new generation born into freedom and education. He opened the ledger and began to read. By the 3rd page, his hands were shaking. By the 10th page, he understood what he was holding. William brought the ledger to his supervisor, a white man named Mr. Carlton, who managed the timber crew. Carlton read through it, his face growing progressively more pale. "This should be reported," William said. "Reported to who?" Carlton asked. "These men are all dead. This plantation doesn't exist anymore. The people involved are scattered or gone." "What exactly do you think reporting this would accomplish?" "It's evidence of crimes. It's evidence of crimes committed by dead men against people who can't be identified because there's no record they existed in the first place." Carlton closed the ledger. "You know what happens if this goes public? Scandal, pain, families destroyed, the descendants of both the victims and the perpetrators, and no justice because there's no one left to prosecute. So, we do nothing. We recognize that some truths don't bring healing. They only bring more pain." William took the ledger back. "Then I'll keep it as a record as proof that it happened even if no one wants to acknowledge it." Carlton didn't stop him. William Harris kept that ledger for the rest of his life. He showed it to his children when they were old enough to understand. He showed it to his grandchildren. He donated it to a historical society in 1959 at the age of 64 with instructions that it be preserved as documentation of a truth that American history often tried to erase. The Historical Society catalogued it, archived it, and filed it away. Very few people ever looked at it. Sarah died in 1879 at age 48. She was buried in the plot behind what had been the quarters in an unmarked grave near Dinah and dozens of others. She never spoke again after losing Claire the first time. But those who knew her said that in her final years, she would sometimes take out a photograph and look at it for hours, her lips moving in silent words no one could hear. Martha lived until 1883, dying at the remarkable age of 93. She'd spent her final years working as a lairess in town, living in a small room above a shop, finally free and more than just name. Before she died, she told the story to her great-niece, a young woman named Harriet, who was training to be a teacher. She told her about the ledger, about the babies, about the systematic eraser of evidence and identity. "Why didn't you expose it?" Harriet asked. "When you had the chance." Martha looked at her with eyes that had seen too much. "Because exposing it would have gotten people killed. We survived by knowing when to speak and when to stay silent. That ain't cowardice, child. That's wisdom bought with blood." But the truth don't always set you free. Sometimes it just gets you buried. Harriet didn't understand then, but years later, when she was researching the history of slavery in Louisiana for a book she was writing, she began to uncover similar stories from other plantations. Whispered accounts, fragmentary records, patterns that were impossible to ignore. Babies who looked white born to enslaved black mothers. Children who disappeared without explanation. Families in cities who suddenly had new servants or wards with suspiciously vague origins. It hadn't been unique to Bellerive. It had been everywhere, woven into the fabric of the entire system. And everyone had known. The white families had known. The enslaved communities had known. The authorities had known. They'd all chosen silence. In the decades following the Civil War, the light-skinned children of Bellerives scattered across America. Some disappeared into white society completely, their origins known only to themselves. They married, had children, built lives free from the stigma and danger of their births. Their descendants today have no idea of the truth buried in their family histories. Others maintained connections to the black community, building lives in the complicated space of mixed-race identity in America. They faced discrimination from both sides. Too white for some, too black for others. A few actively searched for their origins, trying to piece together the fragments of their early childhood memories with the lies they'd been told and the evidence they could find. Thomas spent 30 years trying to locate other children who'd been relocated from Bellerive. He created a network, a quiet system of letters and messages, trying to build a record of who they'd been and where they'd ended up. By his death in 1926, he'd found 23 of the children documented in the ledger. 8 had died young, 15 were alive and scattered from Boston to San Francisco. He documented their stories in a journal that his daughter discovered after his death. She read about her father's